Good evening. Welcome back to another edition of World History with Sister Kate. Tonight's topic is the Thanksgiving and the Pequot War Massacre at Mystic Fort. And I wanted to start this lesson by saying whenever you are looking for facts, you have to go to source documents. You have to go to history. You can't just take opinion, because there is tons of opinion on Thanksgiving and the Mystic Fort Massacre online, most of which is wrong. The opinion is not based on fact, it's based on hysteria or non-fact or whatever. But I've done a lot of research in the last, I'd say 10 years on this subject, and a really good place for you to go to start looking for the facts involved with the Pilgrims and their settlement here in the United States is a book called On Plymouth Plantation, written by William Bradford, who was part of the party who came over on the Mayflower and who ended up being the mayor of the community there for a good, 20, 30 years. There's another book by a local historian called Nathaniel Philbrook, who wrote a book called Mayflower, and in it he does a lot on the politics and the culture and just lots of information about what went on in the Pilgrims community in the early years of it also, and the history of it usually ends around the time of King Philip's War. So I like facts. That's why I like studying history, and I consider the Bible a factual book. And when you're talking about Bible or arguments with religion and everything, I use the Bible as the source document. It's the same with Thanksgiving. And so let's just get into some of the common misconceptions. The first one is that the Pilgrims had anything whatsoever to do with the Pequot War Mystic Fort Massacre, which they did not. There is a very brief mention of it on Plymouth Plantation, and in it a messenger brings the news to William Bradford, and William Bradford makes a comment based on the news brought to him. He never went to that massacre. None of the Pilgrims were involved in that massacre, none of the ones that came over on the Mayflower. You also have to know that the Pilgrims were an offshoot of the Puritans, and the Puritans were a larger group in England at the time, and they did eventually end up beheading Charles I of England and taking power for a while, and then they were overthrown and so on. The Pilgrims considered themselves separatists, and they were arrested twice while they were still in England, Scotland area. They had been arrested for breaking the law and studying the Bible for themselves. That's what they were arrested for. Eventually they flee to Holland, and while in Holland they are illegal aliens, and they are forced to work for pay that is less than citizens would get, and everyone who fled had to work, including children. And there was a lot of hardship. During one of the arrests, the Pilgrims were separated, and the men went on to Holland, and the women were left in England. Terrible thing. And so after being in Holland, I think for about 10 years, the group decided to send some people to the New World so they could start a colony where they could just worship the Lord in the way they thought best. I've seen people quoting that they thought the apocalypse was coming and they were going to, set up some sort of, I don't even know, idealistic, perfect place to live. I didn't remember any of that being in William Bradford's book. I think this is speculation on the part of the people who are saying that. Anyway, they leave, they get to the Americas in November. Terrible, cold. They have been forced to sell some of their provisions because the ship that they were on, there were actually two ships, and one was so bad, I think it either sunk or just couldn't make the journey. And they had to sell some of the food and seeds that they were going to bring over, so they show up with almost no food. They get off the ship, they go on shore, they find many devastated native villages because a plague had gone through a few years before. There had been interaction for a while with fishermen and the natives on that coast. The fishermen would come to the banks of the U.S. and fish and trade, and sometimes take slaves too, because the person named Squanto, who ended up being the native who helped the Pilgrims and spoke English, had been taken to Spain and then gotten free, you know, learned English, and then got to England and was then, I don't remember the details, but you can find it, found his way back to the Americas, and he was in a tribe different than the tribe that the Pilgrims allied themselves with. When they showed up, the tribe that was closest to where they landed, it was the Wampanoags, and their chief, Massasoit, had been, his tribe had been decimated by that plague, and so it was much smaller than it used to be. And I believe it's the Narragansetts, who were off to the west of them, were a major power and wanted to take his whole tribe under their wing, you know, and not in a nice way, like take them over and just absorb them. And Massasoit was really quite concerned about that, and so when the Pilgrims show up, he allies himself with them. And then those two men, at first it was John Carver, because he was the first mayor, but he died soon after taking the office. And so when William Bradford assumed the role, Massasoit then allies with William Bradford, and they actually were very good friends. There was a lot of interaction between the tribes. There was a lot of trading. And when Massasoit was deathly ill, a couple of the men from the Pilgrims go to his camp and pray for him, and he recovers, and they go on in peace, living side by side for another, I can't remember exactly, I think it's close to 50 years. Certainly 30. Okay, so that's the story of the Pilgrims in short. And 100 people show up when they show up in November. 50 of them are from an English like trading company, capital company, and the other 50 are from the Pilgrims congregation. And in the first year, 50 of those people die. So you only have 50 remaining in the year 1621, and that's when the first feast shared between the Wampanoags and the Pilgrims, which becomes the model for the holiday Thanksgiving. That takes place in 1621 in the fall sometime. And if you take into account that William Bradford, near the end of his life, became convinced that you needed to study Hebrew in order to understand the Bible, it's very likely that fall harvest festival, feast, meal, whatever it was that they shared, could possibly have been modeled on the Feast of Tabernacles. It also could have been just a more general fall feast, because while the Pilgrims were in Holland, the Dutch celebrated fall feast type, you know, festivities as well. And so they probably were just celebrating something along those lines of the survivors of the original party and the Wampanoags. And certainly that was not made into a national holiday. It was not made into a national holiday until 200 years later by Abraham Lincoln. So it wasn't something that the Pilgrims did every year, or even if they did, they certainly didn't mention doing that in any way, shape, or form, except the first one. So that's kind of a misconception. Now we need to go to this massacre that everyone likes to tie Thanksgiving in with, and the Pilgrims in with. The massacre did happen. It absolutely was a factual thing. It was at a fort called Mystic Fort, and you are more than able to go online and research that. The Pequot War Museum, which is where I got my, definitely narrowed down to the facts about that war. It was in May of 1637. The Pilgrims came to Massachusetts in 1620. So right there you've got a almost 17-year difference. Okay, so keep that in mind. The massacre and the Pilgrims' arrival, completely different. So 17 years later, I don't think the Pilgrims had any number of people who could actually go anywhere and murder 400 people. That's number one. Number two is the Pequot War was in Connecticut. It was not in Massachusetts. The Pilgrims are on the coast of Massachusetts. This war is in the south, I think, east corner of Connecticut. Rhode Island is in between. Like, it's not just a walk across the border. They are miles and miles apart in a time when the only way to get there would have been to walk or ride a horse. Well, then when you go to the Pequot War Museum PDF, and I'll have a link to that, in not the PDF, but to the page in this description. When you go there, they're very, very clear about the fact that it was 90 Englishmen from Massachusetts Bay. Now, there may have been some Puritans in there. There were certainly nobody from the Pilgrims, because the Pilgrims were an offshoot. They were separate. And the Puritans who came over would have had some military experience. The Pilgrims basically were just a congregation, a church congregation. I think Miles Standish was the only one who had any military experience at all amongst any of them. So the idea that in 17 years, 50 people, not all of whom were men, there were women and children, somehow gave birth to 90 people who then walked all the way to Connecticut and made this massacre happen is ludicrous. It just doesn't make any common sense. The 90 people coming from Massachusetts Bay colony makes more sense because it was a much bigger colony and they had had an influx of people coming over the years. The British also had showed up, those British and others, in Connecticut and Massachusetts, soldiers and traders who wanted to get in on trade, because the Dutch and the Pequot Indians had pretty much a monopoly in at least Connecticut, but also that whole southern New England area since the Dutch showed up in 1611. And so they had been allied for many years, 30 years, 27 years, and had been sort of monopolizing the trade. So that's another fact. A third fact is that that war, even though they say there were 90 Englishmen, there were at least 60 native allies in the forces of the English. So it wasn't just all white men fighting all white men. It was Native American allies and Englishmen against Pequots and their allies. And all of those natives in that area had been fighting each other, little battles back and forth for years and years and years as they tried to gain political control in their area after that plague. So it certainly was not just 90 white guys show up and kill 400 natives. It was a series of events over and over, with the center point being trade, money, influence, power. And the Pequots had been in control for a long time and had been fighting and subjugating many native tribes in the area. And this particular battle came as a series. There were 4 battles. This was the 4th one, but the first 3, the Pequots had won, fighting the English and their allies. So it wasn't like it came out of nowhere. It was something that was happening over and over again, and the Pequots were well aware of what was going on, and they wanted to keep control and had been the military power in the area for a long time. And finally, after so many English settlers and traders get killed, as well as natives, the English really, you know, decided, and there were two, it was like a captain and a lieutenant who were the officers in charge of that military exercise when they go to Fort Mystic, where the Pequots are. It's definitely a military thing. It's no longer just sort of guerrilla warfare. It is a decided action under the military leadership to actually try to win a battle instead of the Pequots winning again. So it's just been completely overdone in the world of the internet. Information put out has been misinformation, disinformation, ignorant. And ignorant doesn't mean you're stupid. It means you're just not educated in this. And these are the facts, and I'm giving you at least 3 places to look them up in the description. So I hope this has brought some clarity to this whole issue. And I won't go over it again. Thanksgiving was not what people say it was. The massacre was not what people say it was. And the massacre itself was not anywhere near the Pilgrims. The Pilgrims had nothing to do with it. So I just hope this has clarified things for you, and bless you. Shalom.